Parish of Hartington on the Wye, in the High Peak of the County of Derbyshire. Account book of the parish for the quarter ending, Lady Day 1819, in the small steady country fashion of the standing custom of this parish since the year of our Lord, 1731. Receipts. Parish rate, Christmas quarter just past, collected by the standing parish overseer, Mr. Elias Wainfleet, £64 8 shillings 3 pence. Surplice fees, Christmas quarter, 5 christenings at 2 shillings 6 pence, 1 marriage at 7 shillings 6 pence, 3 burials at 5 shillings, £1 5 shillings 0 pence. Standing pew rents, Christmas quarter, 28 pews at the standing village rate, £4 4 shillings and 0 pence. Dowager Lady Carteret's Christmas charity paid 24th of December last to Widow Plumtree, Widow Hocking, Widow Goss and old Mr. Ambrose at the parish bench rate, £12. Standing Hartington Park Parish Coal Allowance, quarterly, £4. Total receipts, Lady Day, 1819, £85, 17 shillings 3 pence. Disbursements, Reverend Greatorax, Rector's quarterly stipend, £45, 0 shillings, 0 pence. Parish clerk's salary, Miss Charity Burbage, daughter of the late Mr. Silas Burbage, parish clerk, 1798 to 1815, kept on at the office by standing agreement of the rector since November 1815. £3, 0 shillings, 0 pence. Parish school slate and chalk, quarterly, 9 shillings, 6 pence. Parish coal cart to Widow Plumtree, Widow Hocking, Widow Goss and old Mr. Ambrose, 12 sacks at 1 shilling 4 pence, 16 shillings, 0 pence. Repairs to the south porch of St. Giles's Church, carpenter, Mr. Samuel Hallam, joiner, £2, 2 shillings, 0 pence. New rope for the parish bell of the small bell tower, 8 shillings 6 pence. Total disbursements, Lady Day, 1819, £51, 16 shillings and 0 pence. Net balance to the parish chest, Lady Day, 1819, £34 1 shilling and 3 pence. So drawn up and signed at the small parish desk in the south study of the rectory of Hartington on the Wye, this small composed Saturday morning of the 27th of March, in the year of our Lord, 1819, in the steady country hand of Charity Burbage, parish clerk, in the office of the late Mr. Silas Burbage, her father, by the standing agreement of the Reverend Ambrose Greatorax, rector of the parish. The small south study of the rectory at Hartington on the Wye lay at the south-east corner of the plain stone-built parish house at the lower end of the village street, its single tall sash window looking south across the walled garden to the lane behind St. Giles's Church. The walls were in plain pale cream distemper above the low dark wainscot. A small turkey-red rug lay before the black-leaded grate at the west wall, where a low fire of country coal kept the morning warmth of the room. Beneath the south window stood the parish desk of plain dark oak. Upon the desk lay the open parish account book in its plain calf binding, the freshly blotted Lady Day quarter folded back at the page, just signed. Beside it, the brass standish with the steel pen laid across the inkwell. Beside that, a small beeswax candle in a brass candlestick, unlit at present. A small ribboned bundle of the quarter's standing receipts lay at the back corner of the desk, weighted with a round paperweight of polished Derbyshire Blue John. At the desk, in the steady country composure of a Saturday morning, sat Miss Charity Burbage, 24 years of age, in plain dark serge gown, with a clean white linen collar at the throat, her chestnut brown hair pinned plain at the back of her head, her pale green eyes very steady upon the open ledger. The fire gave its low, warm note to the small panelled room. The standing clock upon the chimney-piece marked the hour at 4 minutes past the 11:30. Charity laid the steel pen across the inkwell and drew the small brass blotting rocker across the freshly written page in the steady country motion of her late father's long instruction. She set the rocker by, lifted the page once to the light to be sure of the ink, and laid it flat. Miss Charity Burbage was the only daughter of the late Mr. Silas Burbage, parish clerk of Hartington-on-the-Wye, from November 1798 until his death at the cottage on the 17th of October, 1815. Her late father had been a steady countryman of plain Derbyshire stock, a small farmer's son of the parish of Bakewell, given the parish clerk's office at the standing wage of £12 a year in the latter end of 1798. He had served 24 years through 3 rectors, had kept the parish registers and account book in his steady country hand, had taught his only daughter from the age of 9 the small, steady bookkeeping of the parish desk, and had died of a long, quiet decline at 58. Charity's late mother, Mrs. Ottoline Burbage née Vine, had been the only daughter of a small Derbyshire schoolmaster of the parish of Tideswell, a quiet countrywoman of mild, composed manners, married to Silas Burbage at Tideswell in the early summer of 1793. She had borne her only daughter at the cottage in May 1794, and had died of a low country fever on the 3rd of February 1812, in the 18th year of her daughter's age. Charity had been 17 at her late mother's death. She had nursed her through the last quiet fortnight. She had stood beside her late father at the small grave at St. Giles's churchyard on the 7th of February. She had taken up the kitchen management of the cottage and had kept it for her late father through the 7 steady years that followed. Her late father's long, quiet decline had begun in the spring of 1814, of a slow country shortness of breath that the old country doctor, Mr. Wool, of the next parish, could not name. Through the winter of 1814 to 1815, he had kept the parish desk at his cottage by the standing kindness of the Reverend Greatorex, who had walked down the lane from the rectory at the parish day with the account book under his arm to sit at the cottage parlour by the fire, while Silas Burbage made the standing quarterly entries. Charity had nursed her late father at the bedside through the long, quiet autumn of 1815, reading aloud through the last fortnight the small chapters of the Gospel of Luke. He had died on the morning of the 17th of October, with the Reverend Greatorex at the chair beside the bed, and Charity at the bedside, in the steady, quiet hour just after the parish bell of 7. The Reverend had read the burial service over him at St. Giles's on the 20th, and had laid him beside Charity's late mother at the south side of the churchyard, beneath the plain stone of country slate the Reverend had paid for out of the standing rectory account. On the following Saturday, the 28th of October, 1815, the Reverend Greatorex had walked down the lane to the cottage and had sat with Charity at the small kitchen parlour table. He had been 56 in that year, white-haired country clergyman, gold-rimmed spectacles, plain black cassock, kindly Derbyshire country voice. He had laid the parish account book upon the table between them and had spoken plainly. "Miss Charity," he had said, "I have read these 24 years of your late father's parish hand, and the steady country entries of your own, these last 4 quarters since the spring of 1814, when he could no longer hold the pen. The hand is your father's. The figures are yours. I cannot find a steadier or more careful hand for the parish desk in this parish or any other. I should be glad to keep the office in your hands, by the standing agreement of the rector, at the standing wage of £12 a year. The cottage shall stand to you at the standing parish rent of £3 a year. You shall draw up the account book at the small parish desk of my own south study of a Saturday morning, that I may be at hand. What do you say, child?" Charity had been 21 in that year, and had had no other place in the world. She had said in steady country composure, "Reverend Greatorex, I shall be most grateful. I shall do my best at the office by my late father's instruction." The Reverend had nodded plainly at the small table, and had laid his hand, once briefly upon the account book between them, and the matter had been settled by standing parish agreement of the vestry on the 2nd of November, 1815. She had kept the office these 3.5 years past. The Reverend Greatorex had raised the standing wage from £12 to £15 a year at Easter 1817, on the vestry's plain commendation of her careful keeping of the account book through the long parish business of the late Dowager's death in the March of that year. The clerk's cottage stood to her still at the standing parish rent of £3 a year, and she had kept it in the small, steady fashion of her late mother's household. The Saturday routine had been settled by the steady agreement of the rector and the parish clerk since November 1815. Charity walked up the lane to the rectory at 5:20 past 9, was at the parish desk by the half-hour, drew up the small standing entries of the past week and the receipts of the parish overseer by 10, made the standing quarterly totals at the half-hour after 10, and had the account book drawn up and signed by the half-hour after 11. The Reverend Greatorex's standing afternoon of the quarter was set at 3 o'clock in the same south study, at which hour he came in from his morning parish round to sign off the book and take a small cup of country tea with his parish clerk by the grate. On the Saturday morning of the 27th of March, 1819, the Lady Day quarter being the standing parish quarter, Charity had drawn up the account book by the half-hour after 11. She had checked the totals once more against the ribboned bundle of receipts at the corner of the desk. She had laid the steel pen across the inkwell. She had drawn the small brass blotting rocker across the freshly written page. The standing clock marked the half-hour, then the 11:45, then the small, steady tick of the long minutes towards noon. She had filed the bundle of receipts in the parish chest at the side of the desk and returned to the chair to wait the rector's standing 3 o'clock. It was at 4 minutes before noon that the steady sound of a horse's hoof came up the lane and turned at the rectory gate. The hoof drew up at the gravel sweep. There was the small sound of a rider dismounting, of gravel beneath the boot, of a plain steady knock at the rectory door. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pyatt, a small grey countrywoman in plain dark gown and white apron, 23 years at the rectory, opened the door. There was the steady sound of a man's voice at the door, low and quiet. Mrs. Pyatt's small country reply. There was the sound of boots upon the flagged passage, a small pause at the study door, and Mrs. Pyatt's plain, steady knock. "Miss Charity?" Mrs. Pyatt said at the door, in her plain country voice. "His Grace the Duke of Hartington is come down to the rectory. He should be glad to see you upon a small parish matter, by the message of Mr. Bromhall at the Hall. The Reverend is at the parish school these 2 hours past." Charity rose from the parish desk, in steady country composure. She set the account book square before her, set the steel pen square at the inkwell, smoothed the plain dark serge at the waist, and said quietly, "Mrs. Pyatt, please show His Grace in." The Duke of Hartington came in at the south study door at 1 minute before noon, in plain dark riding coat, much creased of the road, buckskin breeches, top boots dusty from the lane. He was tall, dark, with the firm Carteret jaw and one streak of silver above the left temple, grey-blue eyes that did not look away. He paused once at the threshold to make sure of the room, a single steady glance, and then came forward in the quiet country way of a gentleman calling upon a small parish business. Charity rose at the parish desk and inclined in the plain country curtsy of the parish clerk's daughter. The Duke inclined gravely at the door in return. "Miss Burbage," he said, in his plain, steady country voice, "forgive the unannounced call. I came down from town last evening on a small parish coal matter I had meant to settle at the Hall this morning with my butler. Mr. Bromhall told me you were here at the rectory finishing the Lady Day account. The Reverend Greatorex he gave me to understand should not be in until 3. I should be glad of 10 minutes of your time at the parish desk. I have come to verify a small discrepancy in the standing Hartington Park parish coal allowance, a standing arrangement of my late father's making of November 1798. Your Grace, Charity said across the small panelled room. I am at the parish desk till the rector's 3 o'clock. You shall be most welcome to consult the account book at this hour. Please be seated, sir. The Duke crossed the turkey-red rug to the chair beside the parish desk in 3 steady steps, drew off his riding glove, laid the glove and his plain dark beaver hat upon the side table beneath the window, and sat at the right hand of the desk with the steady composure of a country landholder at his own parish business. He looked steadily at the open account book before him. Charity had remained standing. She drew the account book gently across the desk leather towards the Duke and laid her hand at the corner of the page. The standing Hartington Park parish coal allowance, Your Grace, she said in her plain country voice, stands at the receipts column for the Lady Day quarter, just struck at £4. The figure is correct by the standing arrangement of your late father's making of the November of 1798, at which the allowance was set at £4 a year, payable in quarterly instalments of £1 at each of the 4 standing parish quarters. She drew the ribboned bundle of receipts from the side of the desk, untied the ribbon, and laid out 4 small receipts side by side at the right of the open page. The 4 standing receipts of the past parish year, Lady Day, Midsummer, Michaelmas, Christmas 1818, are at £1 each, signed by your butler, Mr. Bromhall, in his standing receipt hand. The current Lady Day receipt is at the top of the bundle, signed yesterday by Mr. Bromhall, at the hall, in the same hand. The Duke took up the 4 receipts in his plain firm hand and read them through steadily, in the quiet country way of a landholder verifying his own standing entry. He set them down and laid his hand lightly upon them in the small pause. The figure is at £4 in the present account. Then, he said quietly, looking up at the parish clerk across the open page, the standing allowance my late father set in 1798. Yet I had at the hall an old book in the late dowager my mother's hand, set down at the south parlour writing desk in December 1816, which named the standing allowance at £6 a year. I had supposed for some weeks past that the present account stood in a small running error against the parish. Your Grace, Charity said in her plain, steady country voice across the desk, the standing allowance was increased by the late Dowager Lady Carteret from £4 to £6 a year by her standing instruction of November 1816 on the small extension of the standing Christmas charity. The increase was entered in the account book at the Christmas quarter of 1816 and stood at £6 through the 4 quarters of the parish year, ending Christmas 1816 to Christmas 1817 inclusive. On the death of the late Dowager at the Park in the March of 1817, the standing allowance was reduced by your Grace's own standing instruction at the parish vestry of the 8th of April, 1817, back to the original £4 a year of your late father's setting of 1798. The £4 figure has stood in each of the 8 quarters since. She turned back the account book to the previous folio. Here, Your Grace, at the Christmas quarter of 1817, the first quarter of the reduced allowance, the entry stands at £4, signed off by the Reverend Greatorex on the 3rd of January 1818. Here at Lady Day, 1818, £4, at Midsummer, £4, at Michaelmas, £4, at Christmas, £4, at the present Lady Day, 1819. £4. The 8 entries are at the 8 standing receipts of Mr. Bromhall's hand. The Duke sat very still at the chair beside the parish desk. He looked steadily at the entry at the Christmas quarter of 1817 and at the 7 succeeding entries beneath it in the steady country hand of Miss Charity Burbage. He read them through, quarter by quarter, with the steady composure of a landholder at his own standing business. He turned back at length to the entry of the increase of November 1816 in the steady hand of the late Mr. Silas Burbage, and to the entry of the reduction of April 1817 in the steady hand of Miss Charity Burbage at the next folio. He read both entries through in steady country quiet, then set his hand lightly at the desk leather beside the open page. "Miss Burbage," he said at length, in his plain, steady country voice, "the entries stand as you have set them out to me. The figure at the present account is at £4. The figure is correct by my own standing instruction of April 1817. The small running error I had supposed to lie at the parish desk has lain in fact at my own old reading of the late Dowager's small South Parlour book of December 1816, which I had not in my town business set against the standing account book of these 8 quarters. The fault has been entirely mine." "Your Grace?" Charity said quietly. It was a natural small reading. The late Dowager's small South Parlour book stood at £6 at the November of 1816. The reduction of April 1817 was entered in the standing parish account book at the vestry. The South Parlour book at the park was not amended thereafter. The 2 books have stood at the 2 figures these 2 years past." The Duke inclined his head once gravely at the parish desk in the plain country acknowledgment of a landholder to a parish clerk. He turned the account book back to the present Lady Day folio, and looked once again at the steady hand of the parish clerk in the open page before him. "Miss Burbage," he said, in the quiet country way of a landholder at the parish business, "I had not, in my town business of the past 2 years, known of your office. Mr. Silas Burbage I had known since I was a small country boy at the park. I had known of his death at the latter end of 1815. I had not had since that time the standing parish business in my own hand, it having been kept at the Hall by Mr. Bromhall and by the Reverend Greatorex between them. I had supposed the account book to lie at the rectory desk in some country clerk's hand of the Reverend's engagement. I had not, in my own dullness, set the office in your own hand." Charity inclined at the parish desk in the plain country curtsy of the parish clerk's daughter, and did not at the first moment answer. The standing clock upon the chimney-piece marked the 12:15 in its steady tick. The Duke laid his hand lightly once at the corner of the open page. "I shall not detain you further this morning, Miss Burbage," he said quietly. "The matter of the standing allowance is settled to my satisfaction by the 8 standing entries of the past 2 years in the steady country hand at the open book. I am much obliged to you for the small 10 minutes of your time." He drew his plain country riding glove from the side table beneath the window, and took up his plain dark beaver hat, and rose from the chair. Charity rose also at the parish desk in the steady country curtsy of her standing office. "Your Grace," she said, "it is no trouble. The book stands at your Grace's standing parish business at any hour of the parish quarter." The Duke inclined gravely at the parish desk. He turned to the south study door in 3 steady steps across the turkey-red rug. He paused once at the threshold, with his plain dark beaver hat at his right hand and his glove at his left, and inclined a second time at the open door to the parish clerk at the small parish desk, and inclined this second time deeper than he had inclined on entering at 1 minute before noon. The standing clock upon the chimney-piece marked the half-hour after 12 in the steady tick of the late March morning. The Duke of Hartington passed out at the south study door into the flagged passage of the rectory, and the small, steady sound of his boot went away towards the front door, and away across the gravel sweep, and away down the lane of Hartington-on-the-Wye, towards the standing Hartington Park gate at the end of the village street. Monday morning, the 29th of March, 1819, stood pale and steady over the high peak of Derbyshire. The cold spring light came clear through the leaded south windows of the small south study of the rectory at Hartington-on-the-Wye. The parish desk had been opened at the standing 9 o'clock hour by Charity, the account book set out, the small brass standish refilled, the single beeswax candle trimmed against the pale country morning. Charity had walked across the lane behind St. Giles's at 20 minutes to 9 in her plain dark serge, with the clean white collar, her soft chestnut-brown hair pinned plain beneath a dark country bonnet, her keys to the parish chest at her hand. She had passed the porch of the church, taken the rectory path through the south orchard, and let herself in by the standing arrangement of the Reverend Greatorex's keeping since 1815. The fire had been laid at the small grate by the rectory girl Esther at 7. Charity had built it up steady at 20 minutes past 9. The Reverend Greatorex was at his standing Monday morning, visiting of the village from 10 until 1, old Mr. Ambrose at the small cottage at the foot of the street, Widow Goss at the parish bench cottage by the bridge, and the carpenter Mr. Hallam's wife, who had been ill since Christmas. The south study stood the parish clerk's room through the morning by the standing arrangement of the rector. Charity had at her hand the parish call certificate promised from the hall at the Saturday call of the Duke. The standing allowance from Hartington Park stood at £4 a year, paid quarterly by the present Duke's instruction at his late mother's death in March 1817. The Lady Day quarter's £1 was to be brought down to the rectory in person, that the entry might be set in the parish book at the parish clerk's own hand. It was a small matter of country form. It was the standing form since 1798. At 12 o'clock, the brass knocker of the rectory's south door was struck once. Charity heard Esther across the flagged passage, heard her at the door. "Your Grace," and the firm country voice of the Duke at the threshold. Charity rose from the parish desk, set the steel pen across the standish, smoothed the front of the plain dark serge, and stood composed. The study door opened. Esther stood aside. The Duke stepped through. He was as he had been at the Saturday noon, tall, the firm Carteret jaw clean above the plain black neckcloth, the one streak of silver above the left temple, grey-blue eyes that did not look away. He wore a dark grey country morning coat, plain buff breeches, plain black riding boots dusted with the lane between the park and the village. He carried in his right hand a folded parchment with the Carteret seal at the foot, and inclined to Charity in a small, steady bow. "Miss Burbage, Your Grace, I have brought the standing parish call certificate of the Lady Day quarter, drawn up at the South Library at the park this morning by my own hand, signed and sealed at the standing form. I should be glad if you would enter it in the parish book at your standing pace. I shall sit the half hour. Your Grace, I shall enter it." Charity took the folded parchment from his hand. The Duke moved to the small, straight-backed chair beside the desk, the chair the Reverend Greatorex took on the Saturday afternoon of the quarter for the signing off, and sat composed. He set his gloves upon his knee, his hat upon the side table at the south window, and folded his hands quiet. Charity unfolded the certificate. The country bookkeeping hand of the South Library at Hartington Park stood plain across the parchment, the standing Carteret estate clerk's hand, the form as it had stood at the parish chest since 1798, the Duke's own signature firm at the foot beside the small red seal. Charity dipped the steel pen and set the entry across in steady bookkeeping hand. The candle burnt steady at the desk. The pale spring light stood quiet through the leaded windows. The Duke sat composed at the chair beside her, grey-blue eyes upon the parish book, the small silence unbroken. When the entry had been struck across, and the receipts column at the foot of the Lady Day page adjusted for the standing £1, Charity blotted the page with the brass blotter, set the steel pen across the standish, and looked up. "The entry is set, Your Grace. The Lady Day total stands at £85, 17 shillings, 3 pence at the receipts column. The standing parish coal of £1 is entered at the receipts side, the certificate filed at the parish chest by the standing form. Very good, Miss Burbage. The Duke did not rise. He sat at the chair beside the desk and looked at her, the grey-blue eyes quiet, at the pause of a man who has come to ask a thing and shall ask it plainly. Miss Burbage, I have a small further matter, if you should be willing to answer. Your Grace, of your late father, of your own 4 years at the office. I had not, in my town business, known until the Saturday last that the parish clerk of Hartington had been a country woman these 4 years past. I should be glad to hear of it plainly. Charity stood quiet a moment, her hands folded at the front of the plain dark serge, the clear pale green eyes very steady upon him. She gave the answer at the steady pace of the parish clerk's office. Your Grace, my late father, Mr. Silas Burbage, held the parish clerk's office of Hartington on the Wye from 1798 until his death in October 1815. He had been the parish clerk 17 years. He kept the parish account book at the small parish desk in the south study of the rectory by the standing arrangement of the Reverend Greatorex from the rector's coming to the living in 1802. He took the standing parish clerk's salary of £3 the quarter and the standing surplice fees by the country form. And your own 4 years, Miss Burbage. Your Grace. I nursed my father through the long quiet decline of 1814 and 1815. He died at the small clerk's cottage in the lane behind St. Giles's at the close of October, 1815, in the 58th year of his age. The Reverend Greatorex, who had stood my father's parish rector since 1802, kept me at the office by his own standing agreement at the salary of £12 the year, from November 1815 forward. The salary was raised by the rector's direction to £15 the year at Lady Day 1817, upon a steady management of the account book. And the cottage, Miss Burbage. Your Grace. I live at the small clerk's cottage in the lane behind St. Giles's at the standing parish rent of £3 the year. The cottage was my late father's standing cottage from 1798. The rent is paid to the parish chest at each Lady Day quarter. Very good, Miss Burbage. The Duke sat the further pause at the chair. He had not, through the steady answer, looked away from her. He gave no particular comment at the close. He gave the steady reception of a plain answer plainly given. Then he rose, took up his hat from the side table, his gloves from his knee, and inclined to Charity at the threshold. Miss Burbage, I am obliged to you for the entry, and for the answer. Your Grace. He went out through the study door at 12:30. Charity heard the footfall across the flagged passage, heard Esther at the door. Your Grace, and heard the south door close behind him. She sat a further moment at the desk in composure. The Monday noon stood quiet over the panelled rooms. Wednesday, the 31st of March, 1819, came pale and cold. At 12, the brass knocker of the rectory south door was struck once, and the Duke was at the threshold of the south study at 12:05, in the same dark grey morning coat, the buff breeches, the riding boots dusted with the lane. He carried at his hand a small parcel of 4 receipts in country paper. Miss Burbage, I have brought the Christmas charity disbursement receipts of the 4 standing pensioners of the parish bench, Widow Plumtree, Widow Hocking, Widow Goss, and old Mr. Ambrose. They were paid at the standing form on the 24th of December, last from the late Dowager's standing Christmas charity at £3 each. The receipts have lain at the South Library writing table since my mother's death. I should be glad if they were entered to the disbursement side of the account book at the standing form. Your Grace, I shall enter them. The Duke took the small, straight-backed chair beside the desk at the steady country pace. Charity unfolded the 4 small country receipts at the parish desk. Each stood in the small country hand of the pensioner concerned, Widow Plumtree's small, steady country signature beneath the small, steady country acknowledgement of her £3 at the parish bench rate of the late Dowager's standing Christmas charity. Widow Hocking's small country mark, witnessed by the standing parish overseer, Mr. Wainfleet, beneath the small, steady country acknowledgement of her £3. Widow Goss's small, steady country signature. Old Mr. Ambrose's small country mark, witnessed by the Reverend Greatorex's curate, beneath the small, steady country acknowledgement of his £3. The standing £12 of the late Dowager's standing Christmas charity stood plain across the 4 receipts. Charity entered the 4 receipts at the disbursement side of the Christmas quarters page of the parish book in steady country bookkeeping hand. The Duke sat the half-hour at the small, straight-backed chair beside the desk at the steady country composure of a man composed in another man's house. He read the 4 receipts through with her at the small parish desk. He asked of Widow Plumtree's standing parish coal allowance at the Lady Day quarter, and was answered plainly. He asked of old Mr. Ambrose's standing Saturday country basket from the park kitchen, and was answered plainly. He took his leave at 12:30 at the small, steady country bow at the threshold. Friday the 2nd of April, 1819 came clear and cold over the high peak. At 12 o'clock, the small standing brass knocker of the rectory south door was struck once. The Duke was at the threshold of the small south study at 5 minutes past 12. He carried at his hand the standing Hartington Park quarterly accounts, a small calf-bound book of country bookkeeping, the standing South Library accounts of the Park household for the Lady Day quarter, drawn up at the South Library writing table by the Carteret estate clerk, Mr. Linnell, at the standing form of the standing quarter. Miss Burbage. I have brought the standing Hartington Park quarterly accounts of the Lady Day quarter. There stand at the foot of the household disbursements column 3 small entries that bear upon the parish book. The standing parish coal allowance of £1, the standing parish school slate and chalk allowance of 3 shillings, and the standing parish bell rope allowance of 2 shillings, that are paid from the park by the standing form of the standing quarter to the parish chest. I should be glad if the 3 entries were set at the receipt side of the parish book at the standing form. Your Grace, I shall enter them. The Duke took the small, straight-backed chair beside the desk. Charity opened the small calf-bound book at the small parish desk and found at the household disbursements column the 3 entries. She entered them in steady country bookkeeping hand at the receipt side of the parish book at the Lady Day page. The Duke sat the half-hour at the small, straight-backed chair beside the desk in the same steady country composure of the standing Monday and the standing Wednesday. He read the 3 entries through with her at the small parish desk. He asked of the standing parish bell rope allowance whether the new rope at the small bell tower had been hung at the standing form, and was answered plainly that the new rope had been hung by the parish sexton on the small Monday after Christmas at the standing form. He took his leave at 12:30 at the small, steady country bow. Sunday the 4th of April, 1819 came cold and pale blue over Hartington on the Wye. The small bell of the bell tower of St. Giles's was rung at 5 minutes to 10 in the standing Sunday morning fashion by the parish sexton at the new rope. The village came up the small lane to the south porch of the church at the steady country pace of the standing Sunday morning of the standing quarter. At 10 o'clock, the morning service stood at the standing form. The Reverend Ambrose Greatorex stood at the small reading desk of the chancel, white-haired country clergyman of 58 years, gold-rimmed spectacles upon the small, steady country nose, plain black cassock of country broadcloth at the standing form of the country rector, kindly Derbyshire country voice that had been the standing country voice of St. Giles's since 1802. He took the standing morning prayer at the steady country pace, took the psalm of the standing morning of the standing quarter at the steady country pace, took the lesson from the Acts of the Apostles, and gave the small, steady country sermon of 15 minutes upon the small, steady country text of the standing Sunday morning. The Duke sat in the family pew at the north side of the chancel. The standing Carteret pew of the family at St. Giles's since the year 1731, of plain dark oak, with the small standing Carteret arms at the foot, the small standing red kneeler at the standing place, the small standing prayer book of the late second Duke at the standing rest. He sat in the plain dark grey country Sunday coat, the plain black neckcloth, the plain black country Sunday breeches. He gave the standing responses at the steady country pace. Charity sat in the parish clerk's pew beside the south porch, the small standing pew of the parish clerk at St. Giles's since 1731, of plain dark oak with the small standing parish clerk's stand at the foot, the small standing parish prayer book at the standing rest. She wore the plain dark serge of the standing Sunday morning, the clean white collar, the small dark country bonnet. She gave the small, steady country amens at the standing form of the parish clerk's office. The Reverend Greatorex closed the standing morning prayer at 20 minutes past 11. The small standing benediction came at the steady country pace of the rector's standing form. The village went out at the south porch in the steady country pace of the standing Sunday morning, and the Reverend Greatorex stood at the south porch in the kindly Derbyshire country voice, giving the small steady country word to Widow Plumtree and to Widow Hocking and to old Mr. Ambrose at the steady country pace of his standing Sunday after service. The Duke went out at the north door of the chancel and across the small churchyard path to the standing Hartington Park Lane at the steady country pace. Charity closed the small parish prayer book at the parish clerk's pew, set the small standing kneeler back at the standing place, and went out at the south porch to the small lane behind St. Giles's at the standing pace of her standing Sunday morning home. At 3 o'clock of the Sunday afternoon, Charity sat at the small kitchen parlour table of the small clerk's cottage in the lane behind St. Giles's. The small panelled kitchen parlour stood quiet at the steady country composure of the standing Sunday afternoon. The small grate of the kitchen parlour fire had been built up steady at one. The small standing brass kettle stood upon the hob at the standing form. The small parish book had been brought across from the rectory at the standing form by the Reverend Greatorex's standing direction for the small parish coal calculation of the next quarter at the small kitchen parlour table. Mrs. Plumtree the widow sat across the small kitchen parlour table at the small straight-backed country chair at the steady country composure of a country widow at the parish clerk's table. The standing parish coal calculation of the midsummer quarter stood at the small parish book, the standing 12 sacks at the standing 1 shilling and 4 pence the sack, the standing 4 widows of the parish bench at 3 sacks each, the standing 16 shillings at the foot of the column. Charity had opened the calculation at the small kitchen parlour table at the standing pace of the parish clerk's Sunday afternoon. At 3 o'clock, the small standing brass knocker of the cottage door was struck once in the steady country fashion. Charity rose from the small kitchen parlour table, crossed the small flagged passage to the front door, and opened it at the standing pace. The Duke stood at the small cottage gate, beyond the small country path, in the same plain dark grey country, Sunday coat of the standing Sunday morning, the plain black neckcloth, the plain country hat at his hand. He inclined to Charity at the small cottage door in the small steady country bow. "Miss Burbage, I have come by my standing Sunday afternoon to call. I should not wish to interrupt the Sunday calculation." "Your Grace, Mrs. Plumtree is at the kitchen parlour table at the standing parish coal calculation of the midsummer quarter. You are welcome at the small kitchen parlour fire, if you should care to step in at the small country pace." "I shall, Miss Burbage." The Duke stepped through the small cottage door at the steady country pace, set his plain country hat upon the small standing hat peg at the small flagged passage, and came in at the small kitchen parlour door at the standing pace of a man composed in another man's house. Mrs. Plumtree rose at the small, straight-backed country chair at the small kitchen parlour table in the steady country composure of the parish bench widow at the parish clerk's table. The Duke gave her the small, steady country bow at the standing form. Mrs. Plumtree, Your Grace, you are at the standing parish call calculation of the midsummer quarter with Miss Burbage. I shall not interrupt. I am come to sit the small kitchen parlour quarter hour at the country pace. The Duke took the small straight-backed country chair beside the small kitchen parlour fire at the steady country composure of a country man at a country cottage fire. Charity returned to the small kitchen parlour table at the steady country pace. Mrs. Plumtree returned to the small straight-backed country chair at the parish coal calculation in the standing country composure of the standing Sunday afternoon. The small kettle on the hob came to the steady simmer at the small steady country pace. The small candle on the small kitchen parlour mantelpiece burnt steady. The pale spring light stood quiet through the small leaded country window of the kitchen parlour. The Duke sat at the small straight-backed country chair beside the fire and watched at the steady country pace, at the steady country composure of a man composed at a country cottage fire, while Charity and the widow finished the calculation at the small kitchen parlour table. At 4 o'clock, the calculation stood at the steady country close, the 12 sacks at the standing 1 shilling and 4 pence the sack, the 4 widows of the parish bench at 3 sacks each, the 16 shillings at the foot of the column, Widow Plumtree's standing 3 sacks of the midsummer quarter, set at the standing form. Charity entered the standing figure at the parish book, blotted the small page at the standing brass blotter, and set the small calculation slip at Widow Plumtree's hand at the steady country pace of the parish clerk's table. Mrs. Plumtree, your standing 3 sacks of the midsummer quarter are set at the parish book at the standing form. The standing 1 shilling and 4 pence the sack is the standing rate. The standing parish coal cart will come at the standing Tuesday after midsummer. Thank you, Miss Burbage. Mrs. Plumtree rose at the small kitchen parlour table at the steady country pace, took her small calculation slip in steady country composure, took her plain country shawl from the small standing peg at the small kitchen parlour door, and gave the small steady country bob to the Duke at the small straight-backed country chair beside the fire. The Duke inclined to her at the standing form. She went out at the small flagged passage to the cottage door at the steady country pace of the parish bench widow's standing Sunday afternoon home, and the small cottage door closed behind her at 4 o'clock. The Duke rose from the small straight-backed country chair beside the fire at the steady country pace. He took the small standing country hat from the small standing hat peg at the small flagged passage. He inclined to Charity at the small cottage door at the threshold. Miss Burbage, I am obliged to you for the small kitchen parlour quarter hour. Your Grace. He stepped out at the small cottage gate at the steady country pace of the standing Sunday afternoon. At the small cottage gate he turned in the small lane behind St. Giles's and gave the small composed country bow at the standing form. Charity, at the small cottage door, gave the composed country reply at the standing form. The small lane behind St. Giles's stood quiet at the pale spring afternoon. The small cottage door closed at the steady country composure of the standing Sunday afternoon. By the second week of April, the small country lane behind St. Giles's had grown accustomed to the sight of the Duke of Hartington walking down it on Wednesday afternoons at 3. He came alone, in a plain dark coat, the firm Carteret jaw set in steady country composure, the single streak of silver above the left temple bright in the soft Derbyshire light. He walked from the south gate of Hartington Park, down the church lane and past the small south porch of St. Giles's, and along the little flagged path that led to the small clerk's cottage, where Charity Burbage lived at the standing parish rent of £3 a year. He had begun the standing call on the Wednesday after Easter. He had asked the Reverend Greatorex's permission at the rectory on the Tuesday evening. The rector had given it gravely, in plain country fashion, with a small smile under the white hair and behind the gold-rimmed spectacles. The Duke had then called at the cottage on the Wednesday at 3, sat half an hour at the small kitchen parlour table with Charity, taken a cup of plain country tea, and gone away at 3:30. The first Wednesday had been the 7th of April, the second the 14th, the third the 21st. By the time the 4th came round, on the 28th, the village had grown so used to the sight of the Duke walking down the lane at 3 that the small women at the parish well did not now turn their heads when he passed. They bobbed a small curtsy and went on with their pails. On the third of these Wednesdays, the 21st of April, the Duke had set down his cup and looked across the small scrubbed deal table at Charity in her plain dark serge and her clean white collar. The clear pale green eyes were very steady upon him. The soft chestnut brown hair was pinned plain. The single beeswax candle on the table had not been lit, for the afternoon light through the small west window was still good. "Miss Burbage," the Duke had said in the firm, steady country voice she had grown used to, "I have a small matter to put to you. I would be glad if you would consider it without haste." "Your Grace," Charity had said, "I shall consider it. My eyes," the Duke said, "have grown a little tired with the small print of the estate ledgers. Mr. Travers has set them down in the smallest legible hand of any solicitor's clerk at Lincoln's Inn, and I find at the end of a winter quarter that my reading by candle is not what it was. I should be glad of a country voice. I would be glad if you might read aloud to me at the Hall on Tuesday afternoons, the standing accounts at the first hour, and afterwards, if there is time, a small country book of any choice." Charity sat very still. The clear pale green eyes did not leave the Duke's face. The little gilt clock on the small mantel-shelf above the small grate marked the half-hour with one small composed chime. "Your Grace," Charity said at last, in steady country composure, "I shall be glad to read at the Hall. I shall accept upon the proper terms." "Name them, Miss Burbage." £15 a year additional, Charity said, "paid quarterly out of your Grace's own private allowance, not out of any estate fund, and entered as such in the standing household account schedule by Mr. Travers, Mrs. Fothergill, the housekeeper, present in the room as my chaperone for the whole of each afternoon. 3 hours each Tuesday afternoon, from 1 of the clock to 4 of the clock, in whichever room of the hall your Grace thinks proper for the reading, and no calling of me away from my parish clerk's office in the south study at the rectory on any other day." The Duke had inclined his head, gravely. The grey-blue eyes did not look away. "Miss Burbage," he said, "those are the proper terms. I accept them all. Mr. Travers shall set the matter down in the household account schedule on the first Saturday of next month, and the first reading shall be in the South Library at Hartington Park on Tuesday afternoon, the 27th of April, at 1 of the clock, with Mrs. Fothergill present from 1 till 4. Your Grace." So it was settled. The little gilt clock chimed the third quarter. The Duke took his hat and gloves. He inclined deeper at the cottage door than he had inclined on entering, and he walked back up the church lane towards the south gate of Hartington Park in the soft afternoon light, with the small composed country fields lying on either hand under the pale spring sky. The Tuesday following, the 27th of April, Charity came up the south drive at 20 minutes to 1 in her plain dark serge and clean white collar, a small plain prayer book and a small pocket-book of Cowper's poems in her hand. Mr. Bromhall, the white-haired old butler in his plain black butler's coat, 30 years in service, met her at the small south door beside the lavender walk. He inclined. "Miss Burbage," he said, "His Grace is in the South Library. Mrs. Fothergill is awaiting you in the little anteroom. If you will be pleased to come this way." He led her through the small flagged passage with the row of old country prints upon the wall, and at the little anteroom door, Mrs. Fothergill rose from a small upright chair. The iron-grey hair was tucked under a plain linen cap, the plain bombazine fell in steady country folds, the keys hung at her hip on a small steel chain that gave a soft sound when she moved. The eyes were the steady eyes of a woman 31 years in the Carteret service. "Miss Burbage," Mrs. Fothergill said, "I shall be sitting at my sewing in the small chair under the south window. His Grace is at the long table by the central window. The book is laid out for you upon the small lectern. Pray, ma'am, come in when you are ready." The South Library was a long, quiet country room of pale grey panelling and tall mullioned windows, looking south over the lavender walk to the deer park beyond. 3,000 calf-bound volumes stood in the bookcases. The small fire in the south grate was banked low. The Duke rose from the long writing table by the central window as Charity came in. He inclined. "Miss Burbage, Your Grace." The ledger lay on the table. The chair at the small lectern had been drawn out. Mrs. Fothergill took her seat in the small upright chair under the south window and laid her sewing across her lap. Mr. Bromhall closed the south library door from the outside and took up his standing post in the small flagged passage. The little gilt clock on the south mantel shelf marked one of the clock with a small, composed chime. Charity sat. She drew the ledger towards her. She opened the first page of the Hartington Park household accounts for the quarter ending Lady Day, 1819. She lifted her clear, pale green eyes once to the Duke. He inclined again. She lowered them to the page and began to read aloud in the steady country voice that he had asked for. Hartington Park, household account schedule for the quarter ending Lady Day, the 25th day of March, 1819, drawn up at Lincoln's Inn by Mr. Travers, solicitor of the family. Receipts, standing rentals from the home farm, £352 8 shillings and 10 pence. She read steadily through the quarter's receipts, then the disbursements, then the small schedule of standing charities, and then the standing household wages. The figures fell into the quiet country room like small, clear country coins. The Duke leaned back in his chair, his eyes resting upon the bowl of small spring flowers at the centre of the table, and listened. Mrs. Fothergill's needle moved steadily across the plain linen on her lap. At 2:30, the ledger was finished. Charity laid it aside. She drew the small pocket-book of Cowper's poems towards her. She turned the small leaves to the page where the small green ribbon was set, and began to read aloud the task in the same steady country voice. The Duke closed his eyes. Mrs. Fothergill went on with her sewing. The small fire in the south grate gave one small composed sound of settling ash. She read for the full hour to the chime of 4. She closed the book at the last line. The Duke rose. Mr. Bromhall opened the south library door. Mrs. Fothergill set aside her sewing and rose with her keys, giving the small, steady sound at her hip. "Miss Burbage," the Duke said, "I am much obliged. Tuesday next, at 1:00. Your Grace." She came again on the 4th of May, and again on the 11th, and again on the 18th, and again on the 18th 11th, and again on the 18th, and again on the 25th. By the second Tuesday, Mr. Bromhall had grown so used to her small composed step in the flagged passage that he no longer announced her at the anteroom door. By the third, Mrs. Fothergill had finished one piece of plain linen sewing and begun another. By the fourth, the South Library had grown to feel, to Charity, like a country room she might have known half her life. On the Tuesday of the 11th of May, the ledger was put aside at 2, and Charity took up the first volume of Maria Edgeworth's The Absentee, which the Duke had laid out on the lectern. She read aloud Lord Colambre's first scene in the steady country voice. The Duke rested his grey-blue eyes upon the bowl of spring flowers and listened. Mrs. Fothergill smiled a small, composed smile over her sewing at a turn of Miss Edgeworth's country wit. They read 3 chapters that afternoon. At the chime of 4, Charity closed the volume and rose. "Your Grace," she said. "If your Grace will be pleased, Mr. Bromhall has laid the small marker at the chapter we left. Tuesday next, we shall take the 4th chapter and the 5th. Miss Burbage, I shall be glad of it." On the 18th, they read 3 further chapters of The Absentee. On the 25th, they finished the 2nd volume. On the 1st of June, the Duke had laid upon the lectern the new Ferrier novel, Marriage, lately come down from the bookseller in Bakewell, in 3 small, calf-bound volumes. Charity read the 1st chapter in the steady country voice. The Duke listened. Mrs. Fothergill's needle went steadily across the plain linen on her lap. In the middle of May, the Tuesday of the 18th had been a steady country day of pale sun on the lavender walk. Lady Drusilla Markham and Sir Hubert Markham came over from Markham Hall in Cheshire and put up at the Hall for 3 days. Lady Drusilla was the Duke's married elder sister. She had her brother's dark hair, plain country dress, and kind hazel eyes. Sir Hubert was a stout country gentleman with soft brown hair and a plain dark green coat and a small, steady country smile. They had been married 15 years. They had a son and 2 daughters at Markham Hall, and the small country happiness of a steady country marriage. They arrived on the Tuesday afternoon at 2:30, while Charity was reading at the long table in the South Library. The Duke had told Lady Drusilla in a quiet country letter the week before of the standing Tuesday arrangement. Lady Drusilla, on coming up the South Drive, had instructed Mr. Bromhall to bring her in by the small East Hall without disturbing the reading. She had laid aside her bonnet and gloves. She had walked down the East Passage to the South Library door. She had paused there and listened for a long, quiet minute to Charity's steady country voice reading the 2nd chapter of Miss Edgeworth. When the chime of 4 came and Charity closed the book and rose, Mr. Bromhall opened the South Library door from the outside, and Lady Drusilla and Sir Hubert came in. The Duke rose. Lady Drusilla crossed the long, quiet country room with a small, composed step that had something of her brother's steady country quietness. "Bertram," she said, "Drusilla, Hubert, may I present Miss Burbage of the parish clerk's office at St. Giles's? Miss Burbage, my sister, Lady Markham. My brother-in-law, Sir Hubert." Charity inclined. The clear, pale green eyes met Lady Drusilla's kind hazel eyes steadily. Lady Drusilla took Charity's small, steady hand in her own gloved hand and held it for one quiet country moment. "Miss Burbage, I have heard much of your steady country reading from my brother. Mr. Bromhall has laid the tea in the south drawing-room. Will you take a cup with us before you walk back to the cottage? Lady Markham, I shall be much obliged." They went down the flagged passage to the south drawing-room, Lady Drusilla and Charity in front, the Duke and Sir Hubert behind, Mrs. Fothergill 3 paces behind with the keys giving the soft sound at her hip. The south drawing-room was a country room of pale blue silk panelling and a small fire in the south grate. The tea-tray stood upon the round table at the south window. Mr. Bromhall poured. Lady Drusilla sat upon the small sofa beside Charity. Sir Hubert took the small chair across the hearth. The Duke took the chair beside the south window. Mrs. Fothergill took the small upright chair by the door. "Miss Burbage," Lady Drusilla said, "your reading of Miss Edgeworth was very steady. My brother has the dearest old country library at the Hall, and has not, I think, listened to anything in it with greater quietness this 20 years. He tells me you read Cowper as well. Cowper was my mother's particular author. I am glad to hear him in this house again. Lady Markham, it is a small kindness of his Grace's to ask. The Reverend Greatorex gave his permission, and Mrs. Fothergill is good enough to chaperone." Lady Drusilla's kind hazel eyes rested one quiet country moment upon her brother across the hearth. The Duke did not look away. The little gilt clock marked the half-hour with one composed chime. Sir Hubert took a small biscuit from the plate at his elbow. "Bertram tells me," Lady Drusilla said, that you have kept the parish account book of St. Giles's these 4 years in your late father's office. He showed me the Lady Day book at the rectory. Miss Burbage, it is a very steady book. Lady Markham, my father kept it before me from 98. I keep it as he kept it. You keep it very well. Charity inclined her head a careful country half-inch. She did not blush. She did not flutter. She sat upright in her plain dark serge and clean white collar, with the small plain hands folded composedly upon her lap, and met Lady Drusilla's kind hazel eyes steadily, in the country composure that was the standing manner of the parish clerk's daughter. Lady Drusilla, looking, knew her brother in the same quiet country moment. She set down her teacup. Miss Burbage, Sir Hubert and I stay these 3 days. Will you do me the further kindness of dining with us in the parish clerk's manor on the Wednesday evening here at the Hall? Mrs. Fothergill shall be present at table. Mr. Bromhall shall serve. Lady Markham, I am much obliged. I shall come. So she came on the Wednesday evening, and dined quietly with Lady Drusilla and Sir Hubert and the Duke and Mrs. Fothergill at the small family table in the dining parlour, and went home down the church lane at 9 with Mrs. Fothergill, 3 paces behind, to the cottage gate. Lady Drusilla and Sir Hubert went away on the Thursday morning. In the carriage, Lady Drusilla said one small, quiet country thing to her husband, and her husband said one small, quiet country thing back. On the Tuesday of the 25th of May, the Duke had asked Mrs. Mainwaring, the cook, to send up the country tea-tray at 3:30. They had finished the 2nd volume of The Absentee by the Chime. Mrs. Fothergill had set down her sewing, Mr. Bromhall had opened the south library door, and Mrs. Mainwaring herself had come up with the tray. She was a country woman of 52, with soft grey-brown hair beneath a plain linen cap, warm pale eyes, and a plain blue print cotton with a white apron. She had been 31 years in the Carteret kitchen. She set the tray on the round table by the south window. Miss Burbage, she said, I have brought the small country bread and butter your Grace asked for, and the small plain seed cake of my standing receipt, and the small plain country tea. I hope it shall be to your taste. Mrs. Mainwaring, I am much obliged. It looks a steady country tea. Mrs. Mainwaring inclined gravely, with a composed country smile under the linen cap, and withdrew. Mr. Bromhall closed the door. Mrs. Fothergill came over and took her place at the round table. The Duke took the chair opposite. Charity poured. They drank a small country tea, while the soft, pale sun moved across the lavender walk outside. Miss Burbage, the Duke said, when his cup was set down upon its saucer, Mrs. Mainwaring's plain seed cake is the standing seed cake of my mother's afternoon tea tray these 40 years. I had not, in town, tasted it these 8 winters. I am glad of it this afternoon. Your Grace, Mrs. Mainwaring's seed cake is the standing seed cake of the Saturday parish tea table at the rectory as well, by her kindness to my late mother of 12 years ago. I have known it these 20 years. The Duke inclined. The grey-blue eyes rested one quiet, country moment upon Charity's composed face. Mrs. Fothergill set her teacup down with the small composed sound that was the standing sound of the South Library. Sunday morning, the 30th of May, was a quiet country Sunday of pale sun and a soft west wind across the small Derbyshire fields. The bell of St. Giles's rang the half-hour for the morning service at 10:30. The parish came in across the small flagged path from the lane and through the small south porch. The Reverend Greatorex in the plain black cassock and the gold-rimmed spectacles took the standing morning office in the steady, kindly Derbyshire country voice. Charity sat in the small parish clerk's pew beside the south porch in her plain dark serge and her clean white collar. The Duke sat in the family pew at the chancel end. Mrs. Fothergill sat 2 pews behind Charity, at her own standing pew with the keys laid quiet upon the small cushion beside her. At the end of the service, the parish went out by the south porch. The Duke crossed the small flagged churchyard path and inclined to Charity at the lych gate. The Reverend Greatorex from the south porch saw and gave a small, composed country smile. "Miss Burbage, if I may have the honour of walking with you along the lane to the cottage." "Your Grace, I shall be glad of it." So they walked together up the small country lane behind St. Giles's in the soft, late spring sun. The small lane was edged on either side with hedgeroses just beginning to bud. The small country fields lay quiet to the north. Mrs. Fothergill walked 3 paces behind in steady country chaperonage. The keys gave the small, soft, steady sound at her hip with each step. The bell of St. Giles's behind them gave one last small, composed chime to mark the close of the morning office. They did not speak much. They walked the small lane in the small country quietness of 2 people who had grown used to walking it together. At the cottage gate the Duke stopped. He turned to face Charity. The clear, pale green eyes met the grey-blue eyes steadily. "Miss Burbage." The Duke spoke very quietly. "May I be permitted to ask you a particular question at 3 o'clock on the Saturday next, in the small south parlour of your cottage, with Mrs. Fothergill present?" Charity stood at the small cottage gate. She did not look down. The small, composed country face under the plain country bonnet did not flutter. The small plain hands folded in front of her did not move. The clear, pale green eyes were very steady upon the Duke's. She drew one small, steady country breath in the soft, late spring air. "Your Grace," Charity said, in steady country composure, "you may." The Duke inclined deeper than he had ever inclined to her. He did not take her hand. He did not speak again. He stepped back from the cottage gate and lifted his hat to her once gravely, and lifted his hat to Mrs. Fothergill 3 paces behind her, and turned, and walked back up the small country lane towards the south gate of Hartington Park in the soft, late spring sun. Mrs. Fothergill came up to the cottage gate and inclined. Charity opened the small wooden gate and went through. The bell of St. Giles's stood quiet at the small bell tower behind them. The small Derbyshire evening lay composed and quiet over the small country fields, with the small hedge-roses beginning to bud upon the small lane, and the small lane lying still behind St. Giles's in the soft, late spring sun. Tuesday, the 1st of June. 1819 came in upon Hartington Park as a day of steady summer sunlight, the lawns dry, the limes in full leaf, the rooks at the elms settled to their late morning hush. The stable tower clock struck 11. Mrs. Fothergill, the housekeeper, iron grey hair under her linen cap, plain bombazine, the keys at her hip, had set the south library in order for the afternoon's reading. Mr. Bromhall, the white-haired butler in his plain black coat of 30 years' service, was at the side hall with the brass salver upon a small mahogany table. The morning had every appearance of one of the steady Tuesdays. It did not stay one. At 1:45, a hired post-chaise, yellow, dusty from the London road, the horses lathered at the bits, turned in at the South Lodge, and came up the drive at a pace that no Hartington carriage had ever kept on the home gravel. The chaise drew up. A gentleman descended, ill at the joints from the chaise springs, florid in the face, from a habit of close drinking rooms. He wore a primrose waistcoat of a pale London cut that did not belong on a Derbyshire drive, a coat of dark plum superfine, breeches and top boots in the town fashion, a quizzing glass upon a black ribbon hung over the front of the waistcoat. He carried a flat leather portfolio of the kind one carried out of Furnival's Inn after a long morning with a solicitor. This was Sir Eustace Quibell, a London cousin of the Carteret name, a man of 49, a habitué of the gaming rooms of White's, whose claim upon the family went no further than a small annuity of 300 a year, settled upon him by the late Dowager Lady Pauline in 1804 and continued by the present Duke. The annuity had not been enough for him. He came up the front steps with a forced briskness that did not sit upon his joints, and inquired of Mr. Bromhall whether his Grace was within. His Grace, Sir Eustace, is at present in the South Library at his estate business. Pray, Bromhall, take this card up to him. Pray also be so good as to convey to his Grace that I have come down upon a small matter of legal weight from town, and that I should be the more obliged for half an hour's hearing this morning, the chaise being already paid for. Mr. Bromhall inclined 1/4 inch, took the card, and went up the south stair without altering by a hair's breadth the composure of his step. He returned in 7 minutes. His Grace will receive you, Sir Eustace, in the morning room. He has been so good as to send for Mr. Travers, his solicitor, who is at present at the Hall upon the Lady Day estate business, if you will be so good as to follow me. Sir Eustace had not expected the solicitor. He set his quizzing glass to his eye for half a moment, said only, "Indeed, indeed, quite right of his Grace, quite right," and followed Mr. Bromhall along the south corridor. The morning room at Hartington Park was a pale yellow room at the southeast front, with 3 sash windows giving upon the rose garden, a round mahogany table at the centre, 3 plain country chairs, and 1 armchair drawn beside the standing pier glass. The morning sun lay in a clear, pale square upon the carpet. The Duke of Hartington was standing at the centre window, with his back to the door. He did not turn at once when Mr. Bromhall announced Sir Eustace, but waited until Sir Eustace was a clear pace into the room. Then he turned. He was tall, the firm Carteret jaw quite still, the 1 streak of silver above the left temple plane in the south light, the grey-blue eyes set upon Sir Eustace and not at any time lifting away. "Sir Eustace? Cousin Hartington, cousin, my dear Hartington, I am the more obliged to you for the hearing. I had not thought to find you at the Hall in the present season. The town reports had you down for Tuesday's drawing-room at Carlton House, but I rejoice that I find you here. I rejoice the more for the country air. You will sit, Sir Eustace. Mr. Travers will be with us in a moment." Sir Eustace sat. The Duke did not. Sir Eustace had not thought to find a solicitor already sent for. He drew his portfolio across his knee and tapped the leather flap. "Cousin, a small matter has come up in town. I had had it laid before Mr. Tilling of Furnival's Inn, a most respectable practitioner. Mr. Tilling has written out a letter at my instance. It bears upon a small entry in the Hartington-on-the-Wye parish account book for the Lady Day quarter. An entry, cousin, that has, I am sorry to say, come to the knowledge of some persons in town who feel a small concern for the Carteret name." The Duke did not answer. He was at his standing place beside the pier-glass, his face composed quite still. The door opened on Mr. Bromhall's small step aside, and Mr. Travers came in. Mr. Travers was a thin, grey, scholarly man of 53, the Hartington family solicitor at Lincoln's Inn these 21 years. Gold-rimmed spectacles upon a long, thin Roman nose, plain black superfine of a country cut, a memorandum book under his left arm, and a green baize portfolio under his right. He inclined to the Duke, inclined a measured half-inch to Sir Eustace, and took the solicitor's chair at the table without invitation, opening the portfolio and drawing out a small folio in clear copperplate, the standing Hartington Park Household Account Schedule for 1819. "Sir Eustace," said the Duke at last, "you were saying—" "I was saying, cousin, that Mr. Tilling's letter has been drawn upon the entry of the £15 additional reading stipend paid out of the Hartington Park accounts to a certain Miss Burbage of the parish, for a small standing arrangement of Tuesday afternoons in the South Library. Mr. Tilling's letter takes the view that the £15 in question stands, in its present form upon the parish account book, as a payment of estate funds to a paid country woman not in any servant's office at the Hall, and that such a payment must be considered, by a strict construction of the late Duke's settlements of 1798 and 1804, an improper alienation of estate funds upon a private object, and, in the further consequence, a small embarrassment to the Carteret name in town. He drew Mr. Tilling's letter from the leather portfolio and laid it upon the round mahogany table. Mr. Travers did not at once take it up. He looked across the table at the Duke. The Duke inclined 1/4 inch. Mr. Travers took up the letter, read it through once at the silent, careful pace of a solicitor of 21 years' standing, set it down, opened the household account schedule at the page of the quarter ending Lady Day 1819, and began to read aloud in the quiet, level, country clear voice the Duke had known for the whole of his ducal life. From the standing Hartington Park household account schedule for the year ending Lady Day 1819, drawn up at Lincoln's Inn at the quarterly audit. Disbursements out of the standing Hartington Park estate funds. Lady Day, quarter 1819. Wages to the indoor servants under the schedule of the Second Duke's settlement of 1804. £84, 8 shillings, 6pence, paid through Mr. Bromhall as standing steward. Wages to the outdoor servants. £62, 4 shillings, paid through Mr. Greaves, the home farm bailiff. Standing parish coal allowance, £1. Standing alms to the parish bench widows at the church door on Lady Day, £6, paid through the Reverend Greatorex. Standing maintenance of the Hartington Park Chapel, quarterly, £4. Total disbursement out of the estate funds upon the Lady Day quarter is £157, 12 shillings and 6pence. No other item appears on the schedule. He paused. He turned the page. From a separate schedule of His Grace's personal allowance for the year ending Lady Day, 1819, which His Grace draws by quarterly warrant out of the Carteret Private Bank at Hawes of Fleet Street, and which has been kept separate from the estate funds by the settlement of the late Duke his father of 1798, and by the further settlement of the late Dowager Lady Pauline of 1804, and which is at His Grace's own private disposal, without account to the estate. From this separate schedule, Lady Day quarter 1819, small private outlays at Mr. Hatchard's in Piccadilly upon books for the South Library, £3, 12 shillings. Small private quarterly stipend to Miss Charity Burbage of the parish of Hartington-on-the-Wye, by His Grace's private contract drawn in April of the present year, for the reading of 3 hours each Tuesday afternoon at the South Library under the chaperonage of Mrs. Fothergill, at the rate of £15 a year. Quarterly portion, paid by warrant of the 25th of March, £3, 15 shillings. He set the schedule down. The £15 stipend, Sir Eustace, is drawn upon His Grace's separate private allowance out of Hawes. It is no part of the Hartington Park estate funds. It stands upon no settlement of either the second Duke or the late Dowager. The construction set forth in Mr. Tilling's letter is, with respect to Mr. Tilling, founded upon a misreading of the schedule. There is no improper alienation of estate funds. There is no estate fund at issue. His Grace, in the matter of his own private allowance, is accountable to no person living and to no settlement standing. He closed the green baize portfolio. Sir Eustace tapped his portfolio. The florid colour had deepened a careful shade in his face. He set his quizzing glass to his eye for half a moment, dropped it, drew a breath of the kind a man drew when he had come down from town upon one footing and found himself standing upon another, and went on with the small, slow showings of consideration he had thought to use upon a country relation. I am the more obliged to Mr. Travers for the clearing of the small accounting point. The accounting point being cleared, cousin, most properly cleared, there remains the further matter that is being spoken of in town. The further matter, cousin, of the daily calls upon a small clerk's cottage in the lane behind the village church. The Wednesday calls and the Sunday walks back from the morning service. Cousin, I should not wish to put it more plainly than I must. The country eye is one thing, the town eye is another, and I have been most particularly desired by certain ladies of my own acquaintance in town to lay before you the further matter that the Wednesday calls and the Sunday walks back, and the Tuesday afternoons at the library taken together stand, in town, upon a construction that does not, in the present moment, stand altogether to the credit of the country lady's name, nor to the credit of the Carteret name. The construction is, that there is, in short, between his Grace and the parish clerk's daughter of Hartington-on-the-Wye, a connection of a private kind that the parish account book has, I shall not say covered, has, perhaps, embellished, with the particular of a salaried office. I do not myself form the construction. I only convey it. I lay it before you as a kindness. He laid it before the Duke. Hands open at the table. The primrose waistcoat lifted a small breath at the belly, the quizzing glass swinging once upon its black ribbon. The Duke had not moved from his place beside the pier glass for the whole of the reading. He moved now. He took one quiet step to the round mahogany table, set the tips of 2 fingers upon the edge of the schedule, and looked steadily down at Sir Eustace. The grey-blue eyes did not look away. Sir Eustace, you have my answer in a single sentence. Miss Burbage is the parish clerk of this parish in the office of her late father. She is at present resident at the small clerk's cottage in the lane behind St. Giles's at the standing parish rent. She's been engaged by my own private contract to read at the South Library 3 hours each Tuesday afternoon under the chaperonage of my housekeeper, Mrs. Fothergill. You have no claim upon any of the present matter, and you have no right to use any country lady's name in the cause of your own embarrassment at White's. Mr. Bromhall, his lordship is leaving us. Good morning. It was said as one steady, cool sentence in the country clear voice of a Duke of Hartington. There was no lifted note. There was no second word. The Duke turned 1/4 of an inch, set his back to the table, and went again to the centre window. Sir Eustace half rose, set his hand at the edge of the leather portfolio, opened his mouth upon a small further showing of consideration, found that the Duke's shoulder did not turn, and closed his mouth again. He took up Mr. Tilling's letter. Mr. Travers slid it across to him without lifting his eyes, folded it into the leather portfolio, drew the strap over the flap, and stood. Mr. Bromhall was at the door. He opened it at the standing 1/4 inch and inclined the standing 1/4 inch. If you will be so good, Sir Eustace, as to come this way. The chaise is at the south steps. I have desired the postilions to be ready upon his Grace's wish. Sir Eustace was got down the south corridor, through the side hall, out at the south steps, into the hired chaise, with the same composed country pace Mr. Bromhall used at any standing morning's business. He did not look back at the morning-room window. The Duke did not look out. The chaise was turned at the lower sweep, the horses set going at a pace less brisk than they had come in upon, and the yellow chaise and the primrose waistcoat were gone at 12:30 down the long drive between the limes. Mr. Bromhall stood at the south steps until the chaise had passed the lodge, then came in at the side hall and went back to his place beside the salver. In the morning-room, the Duke had not moved from the window. Mr. Travers closed the schedule into the portfolio and sat composedly until the Duke should speak. The Duke spoke after a careful interval. Travers, be so good as to draw up a quiet inquiry through your London office into Sir Eustace's standing at White's, his standing with Mr. Tilling, and any standing he may have at certain houses in Pall Mall. I do not wish a town noise. I wish quiet, exact information by Saturday week. It shall be done, Your Grace. I shall write to Mr. Wadley of my office this evening, and I shall have the substance of the matter by Friday's post. I am obliged to you. I shall be at the cottage in the lane behind St. Giles's at 3 o'clock this afternoon, with Mrs. Fothergill. It shall, Your Grace. The Duke inclined 1/4 of an inch and turned again to the window. Mr. Travers took up his portfolio and went out at the small Lincoln's Inn pace that had not altered in 21 years. At 1:15, the Hartington Park gig was at the south steps. Mrs. Fothergill, the basket of plain, mending upon her knee, was already upon the back seat. The Duke came down in a plain country coat of dark green, buff breeches and top boots. He took the reins of the bay cob from Mr. Greaves, and the gig went out at the lodge at a quiet pace down the lane to the village. The lane behind St. Giles's was a dry country lane of pale Derbyshire limestone, with the south side of the churchyard wall upon the left and a row of 7 whitewashed cottages upon the right. At the third stood the parish clerk's cottage. Charity Burbage had kept at the parish rent of £3 a year since her father's death in October 1815. A white gate, a flagged path, a low door of weathered oak, a kitchen parlour window with plain dimity curtains drawn back. The Duke drew up at 5 minutes before 3. Mrs. Fothergill stepped down with her basket. The Duke set the reins to the cob's tether ring at the church wall, took off his hat at the gate, and let Mrs. Fothergill go in first. Charity Burbage was at the kitchen parlour table within. She was small, neat, soft chestnut brown hair pinned plain, clear pale green eyes very steady, in plain dark serge with a clean white collar. Parish clerk's daughter's dress. The parish account book was at her right hand, the brass standish at her left, the steel pen composedly upon the pen rest. She rose at the step at the door. "Your Grace?" Mrs. Fothergill. Miss Burbage. Mrs. Fothergill set her basket down upon the corner of the dresser, took up her plain mending, drew the low rush chair at the south corner of the kitchen parlour, and sat with her work 3 paces from the table. The Duke set his country hat upon the peg by the door, drew the plain country chair across from Charity, and sat. He did not at once speak. He set his 2 hands composedly upon his knees and looked at Charity for a careful interval. Then he told her plainly what had been said. He told her the arrival of Sir Eustace Quibble at a quarter before noon. He told her Mr. Tilling of Furnival's Inn's letter. He told her the household account schedule that Mr. Travers had read aloud. He told her the further showing of consideration upon the daily calls. He told her, plainly and quietly, the construction that was being spoken of in certain town drawing-rooms. He told her his single steady sentence in answer. He told her that he had sent Sir Eustace out at the lodge at 12:30, and that he had set Mr. Travers upon a quiet, exact inquiry by Friday's post. He told her that he would not have her name set down in town under any construction by any man living. Charity sat composedly at the table through the whole of the telling. The clear, pale green eyes did not lift from his face. The small, steady hands did not lift from her lap. Mrs. Fothergill did not look up from her mending. The kitchen parlour clock upon the chimney-piece ticked the quiet country quarters. When he had told her the whole, he laid one hand upon the table, looked steadily across, and spoke the further plain word he had come down to the cottage to speak. "Miss Burbage, I cannot in honour ask you the question I had intended to ask, while a slander hangs over your name in town. I shall ask it when the slander is laid to rest." Charity sat still. The clock ticked 1/4. She answered in the steady country fashion of her own composure. No lift, no fall. The country clear voice of a parish clerk's daughter of Hartington-on-the-Wye. "Your Grace, I shall wait." The Duke inclined 1/4 of an inch across the table, set his hands at its edge, and rose. Mrs. Fothergill rose, gathered her mending into her basket, took up the basket. Charity rose. The 3 stood for a careful interval at the table, with the clock ticking on the chimney-piece, and the south light pale upon the polished pine boards. The Duke took his hat from the peg, went to the low door, lifted the latch, and set it open upon the flagged path and the white gate and the lane behind St. Giles's. He inclined to Charity at the door. He inclined deeper than he had inclined at the morning-room window or at the south steps of the hall. He inclined as he had inclined at the rectory study door upon the noon of the 27th of March, and a small further measure than that. "Miss Burbage, until Friday." "Your Grace, until Friday." He went out at the low door. Mrs. Fothergill went out behind him. Charity stood at the kitchen parlour door and watched the Duke set Mrs. Fothergill into the back seat of the gig, take up the reins of the bay cob, and turn the gig in the dry country lane. The cob set off at a composed country pace down the lane behind St. Giles's, the gig wheels quiet upon the pale limestone, the bell at St. Giles's striking the 3:15 as the gig passed the south gate of the churchyard. Charity stood at the low door of the cottage until the gig had gone out at the turning at the end of the lane, and the composed country sound of the cob's hoofs was lost in the afternoon hush of the village. Then she closed the low door. She set the latch. She went back to the kitchen parlour table. She took up the steel pen from the pen rest. She set the parish account book open at her right hand. She set her two small steady hands upon the table at the composed country composure of waiting. The clock ticked the quiet country quarters at the chimney-piece. The south light at the dimity-curtained window lay pale upon the polished pine boards. She would wait. Lady Drusilla Markham went up to town on the Monday morning of the 21st of June, 1819, by the standing post-chaise from Markham Hall, with Sir Hubert beside her in his plain dark green coat, and she put up at the Carteret townhouse in Berkeley Square for the season's closing fortnight, with the steady intention to set the country matter publicly straight in 3 London drawing-rooms within 10 days. She had heard the slander from her brother by his plain letter of the 8th of June, and had said to Sir Hubert across the breakfast table that she should go up. Sir Hubert had said only that he should be pleased to go up with her, and had ordered the post-chaise for the Monday following. The first call was paid upon Lady Sefton at her townhouse in Arlington Street on the Wednesday afternoon of the 23rd of June at 3 o'clock. Lady Sefton received Drusilla in the small front drawing-room above the street, in plain primrose silk, with a small spaniel at her foot, and a tea-tray standing upon the rosewood table. They were old friends from the small Bath seminary of Miss Pinkerton in 1798. "Drusilla," said Lady Sefton plainly, "you have come up on purpose. I see it in your face." "I have come up on purpose, Maria," said Drusilla, and she sat down upon the primrose sofa and took her tea, and folded her hands in her lap in the steady country fashion of her brother's family. "You will have heard," she said, "the slander put about in this town in the last fortnight by my cousin Sir Eustace Quibell touching the parish clerk at my brother's parish in Derbyshire." "I have heard it," said Lady Sefton. "I heard it at Lady Castlereagh's on Friday last. I heard it twice on the Saturday. I should be very glad, Drusilla, to hear the country truth from a Carteret of the family." "Then," said Drusilla in her plain, quiet voice, "I shall set it before you in the country fashion my brother would, if my brother were a woman with leisure for London drawing-rooms. Miss Charity Burbage is the parish clerk of Hartington-on-the-Wye, in the High Peak of Derbyshire, in the office of her late father, Mr. Silas Burbage, who held the office from 1798 until his death in October 1815. She has held it herself by the standing agreement of the Reverend Greatorex, the rector, since November 1815. She is paid by the parish at the standing salary of £3 the year. She resides in the parish clerk's cottage in the lane behind St. Giles's at the standing parish rent of £3 the year. She is engaged by my brother's own private contract, drawn against his own private allowance, not against any farthing of the estate, at £15 the year, to read aloud at the South Library at Hartington Park, 3 hours each Tuesday afternoon from 1 o'clock until 4, under the chaperonage of my brother's housekeeper, Mrs. Fothergill, who is 57 years old and has been in the family 32 years. The whole matter is open and stands in the parish account book at the small parish desk in the south study of the rectory, which any honest gentleman of this town may go down into Derbyshire and read for himself with the rector's leave. Lady Sefton set her own cup down upon the small rosewood table. "That is plain," she said. "It is plain," said Drusilla, "because it is the country truth, Maria, and the country truth wants no decoration. My brother has done nothing in this matter that he should not have done before the rector and the parish and the small standing custom of 200 years. My cousin Sir Eustace has gambling debts in this town. He has put the slander about because he hopes to extract a settlement out of my brother by the fear of a country lady's name. He shall extract no settlement. My brother does not pay slander. He shall have no settlement out of this house either, said Lady Sefton plainly, and he shall have no card at Almack's, Drusilla, while I have the writing of them. I shall speak to Esther Villiers this evening at the private concert at Lady Jersey's. I am much obliged to you, Maria, said Drusilla. You are not obliged to me. You have given me the country truth. The country truth has its own legs in this town. They sat the further 3/4 of an hour over the tea-tray. At 4:15, Drusilla rose. Lady Sefton kissed her at the drawing-room door, and the footman handed Drusilla into the post-chaise at the curb. The second call was paid upon the Duchess of Devonshire at Devonshire House on the Friday afternoon of the 25th of June at 4 o'clock. The Duchess received Drusilla in the green drawing-room at the head of the great stair in plain dove-grey silk. They were Carteret and Cavendish cousins of the third remove, and the Duchess had stood at the late Dowager Lady Carteret's funeral at St. Giles's in March 1817. Drusilla took her tea and set the matter before the Duchess, in the same plain country fashion. The parish clerk of Hartington-on-the-Wye, the standing parish rent of £3 the year, the standing parish salary of £3 the year, the private contract at £15 the year drawn from her brother's own private allowance, the 3 hours each Tuesday afternoon from 1 o'clock until 4, under the chaperonage of Mrs. Fothergill, the parish account book open at the small parish desk in the south study of the rectory. The Duchess heard her out without moving. "Drusilla," she said in her steady Cavendish voice, "your brother has done the country gentleman's thing in the country gentleman's house, and your cousin has done the bankrupt's thing in the bankrupt's town. I shall stand the country side of it. At this house, at the Saturday card tables of this town, and at the dinner of the Lord Chancellor on the Wednesday following, where Sir Eustace had hoped to have a card through Lord Pevensey. Lord Pevensey shall not write the card. I am much obliged to your grace. You are not obliged to me, Drusilla. The Carterets did not put about the slander. The Carterets shall not be obliged to anyone for the lifting of it." At 5:15, Drusilla rose. The Duchess walked her to the head of the great stair, and the footman handed Drusilla into the post-chaise at the curb of Piccadilly. The third call was paid upon the Countess Spencer at Spencer House on the Tuesday afternoon of the 29th of June at 3 o'clock. The Countess received Drusilla in the small library at the rear of the great house in plain dark French grey silk. She was the eldest of the 3 ladies and the most exact, and she had known the late second Duke of Hartington, Drusilla, and Bertram's father, dead at 63 of a quiet apoplexy in March 1810, for the greater part of 40 years. "Drusilla," said the Countess plainly at the small library door, "your father, were he alive, would have come up himself for this. Sit down." Drusilla sat. She took the cup of tea the Countess herself poured, and set the matter before her in the same plain country fashion she had set it before Lady Sefton and the Duchess, Miss Charity Burbage, parish clerk of Hartington-on-the-Wye, in the office of her late father, Mr. Silas Burbage, parish clerk, 1798 to 1815, kept on by standing agreement of the Reverend Greatorex since November 1815, resident at the small clerk's cottage in the lane behind St. Giles's at the standing parish rent of £3 the year, engaged by the Duke's own private contract at £15 the year for 3 hours each Tuesday afternoon under the chaperonage of Mrs. Fothergill, the housekeeper, the whole matter open and standing in the parish account book. The Countess heard her out without speaking. "Drusilla," she said, "I have known your family 40 years. There is no Carteret of the line of the second Duke who would have done other than your brother has done. The parish clerk's daughter has been kept at the parish clerk's office at the parish clerk's salary and the parish clerk's cottage, as a country parish keeps its own. The private reading stipend is £15 the year out of a gentleman's own private allowance, with the housekeeper at the door, between 1 and 4 on a Tuesday. That is the country gentleman's contract, the one my father would have made, and your father would have made, and any country gentleman of the High Peak would have made. Yes, said Drusilla quietly. Your cousin, said the Countess, is not a country gentleman. He is a London gambler with a primrose waistcoat and a quizzing glass on a black ribbon. He shall not stand in this house, and he shall not stand at White's. I shall write tonight to my nephew Lord Althorp, who is on the committee, and the matter shall be settled at White's by the Wednesday following. I am much obliged to your ladyship. You shall not be obliged to me, Drusilla. You are a Carteret of Hartington. At 4:30, Drusilla rose. The Countess walked her to the library door, and the footman handed Drusilla into the post-chaise at the curb of Piccadilly in the steady London rain. By the 10th of July, the London drawing-rooms had carried the country truth at their own pace, and by the 14th it was reported back to Lady Drusilla at Berkeley Square in a short morning call from Lady Sefton, who came in primrose silk at 11:30. "Drusilla," she said plainly, "I have come to tell you what was settled at White's at the Wednesday committee meeting of yesterday evening. Lord Althorp put the matter to the committee at 8:30. The committee was 5 gentlemen, Lord Althorp, Lord Pevensey, Mr. Gerard Vaux, Sir Roderick Pelham, and the old Earl of Crewkerne in the chair. The matter was put plainly. Sir Eustace Quibble has put about a slander upon a country lady of a country parish in the High Peak, who is the parish clerk of that parish in the office of her late father. He has done it in the cause of his own embarrassment of £5,800 at the gaming table to a Mr. Crockford of Pall Mall. He is no longer welcome at the club. He was struck off the list at 9:30. He was told at 10:30 by Mr. Gerard Vaux at his lodgings in Half Moon Street. He left town at first light this morning, for, it is said, his brother-in-law's small place at Tunbridge Wells. He has gone, said Drusilla quietly. He has gone, Drusilla. The London drawing-rooms have done their country work. The countryside stands. At 12:30, Lady Sefton rose. She kissed Drusilla at the drawing-room door. Drusilla sat down at the writing-table in the front drawing-room and wrote to her brother at Hartington Park, in her plain country hand, the composed letter that he might know the matter publicly laid to rest. She sealed it with the Carteret seal and gave it into the footman's hand at 1:30 for the afternoon post into Derbyshire. The letter reached Hartington Park on the Friday morning of the 16th of July at 10:30. Mr. Bromhall brought it on the silver tray to the South Library, where the Duke sat at the writing-table over the standing estate rent schedule. The Duke read it through twice. He folded it and set it beside the schedule, and sat the quarter hour in the steady Carteret silence, and then he rose and walked to the south window and stood there a further quarter hour, looking down across the south lawn to the south gate. That same Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock, Mr. Travers came down from London upon his own separate inquiry, which he had set forward at the Duke's instruction of the 2nd of June. He had taken the morning mail at 5 and had reached the inn at Hartington-on-the-Wye at 1, and had walked the half-mile up to the hall in his plain black superfine, with his gold-rimmed spectacles in his small steel case, and his leather portfolio under his arm. Mr. Bromhall showed him to the South Library at 3. The Duke set the schedule aside, and Mr. Travers took the chair opposite and laid the leather portfolio upon the tabletop, and drew from it 3 plain pages of his own steady scholar's hand. "Your Grace," he said in his quiet Lincoln's Inn voice, "I have set the inquiry forward at 3 points over the past 6 weeks. The first is Sir Eustace's standing at the gaming tables of this town. The second is the standing of his Furnival's Inn solicitor. The third is his standing at his bank in the Strand. May I lay them before your Grace?" "Lay them, Mr. Travers." Mr. Travers laid them. At the gaming tables, Sir Eustace owed £5,800 to a Mr. William Crockford, late of Newmarket, presently of number 50, Pall Mall, in the small private gaming house Mr. Crockford had set up the previous autumn at that address. The figure was certified by Mr. Crockford's own book, of which Mr. Travers had had, by a Lincoln's Inn acquaintance, a written assurance. Sir Eustace had paid no part of it since the 1st of January. His Furnival's Inn solicitor, Mr. Septimus Tilling, the country attorney whom Sir Eustace had engaged in the 2nd week of May to draw the threatened parish account book suit, could not file the suit without a fee paid in advance. The fee, for the draft of the bill, the Chancery filing fee, and Mr. Tilling's own retainer, stood at £120. The fee had not been paid. Mr. Tilling had told Mr. Travers, when Mr. Travers had called at his chambers in plain Lincoln's Inn courtesy on the Tuesday of the previous week, that he should not file the suit until the fee was paid, that he had had no money from Sir Eustace since the 14th of May, and that he was not himself, in plain country fashion, hopeful of receiving it. His bank, Sir Eustace's account at Coutts's in the Strand, stood at the small overdrawn figure of £207. There was no security against the overdraft. The bank had written to him on the 11th and 28th of June in the composed banking fashion of Coutts's. "Then," said the Duke quietly, "Mr. Tilling shall not file the suit. Mr. Tilling shall not file the suit, Your Grace. He shall not in any honest expectation be able to file it. The threatened suit is, in plain Lincoln's Inn language, a slander dressed in a paper coat, and the paper coat shall not be paid for. And Mr. Crockford? Mr. Crockford shall stand at the head of any list of Sir Eustace's creditors hereafter drawn up. Sir Eustace shall not, by any honest reckoning, recover his standing at the gaming tables of this town in his own lifetime. He is set, said the Duke. He sat the half-minute in the steady Carteret silence and inclined to Mr. Travers across the table. "I am much obliged to you." "Your Grace is not obliged to me. The parish account book at the rectory is open. Your Grace's own private contract is open. The parish clerk's cottage at £3 the year is open. The whole matter has stood at the small parish desk in the south study of the rectory all the quarter from Lady Day, and the London Slander has at no point stood at any desk anywhere." "No," said the Duke, "it has not." Mr. Travers gathered his pages back into the portfolio. He took a glass of the South Library Madeira at Mr. Bromhall's hand at 4. At 4:30, the inn-trap came up to the south door, and Mr. Travers went down the south drive, and the south gate closed behind him at 20 minutes to 5. Through the further weeks of July at Hartington, the country pattern of April and May and June stood firm at its own pace. On the Tuesday afternoons, Charity came up from the clerk's cottage at 12:30, and read aloud at the South Library from 1 o'clock until 4, with Mrs. Fothergill at her plain sewing in the wing-chair beside the south window, and Mr. Bromhall at the door at the standing half-hourly intervals of Hartington Park custom. They had finished the Cowper at the end of May, and the Edgeworth at the middle of June. They had taken up the new Ferrier novel at the 3rd Tuesday of June, and were 3/4 of the way through it by the 3rd Tuesday of July. And Charity read it in her plain country voice, with the clear, pale green steadiness of her parish clerk's daughter's reading, and the Duke sat in the wing-chair at the South Library hearth, and listened without moving. On the Wednesday of the 21st of July at 3 o'clock, the Duke called at the clerk's cottage at the standing Wednesday hour, as he had called every Wednesday since the 2nd Wednesday of April. He sat in the wing-chair at the south side of the kitchen-parlour table, and Charity sat opposite at the parish coal calculation for the next quarter. And Mrs. Plumtree, the widow, was at the chimney-corner with the coal list in her hand, and they spoke of the standing Michaelmas quarter coal allowance for the 4 widows. At 4:15, the Duke rose and inclined and went out by the cottage gate, and the Carteret carriage took him up at the lane end. On the Sunday morning of the 18th of July at the morning service at St. Giles's, the Reverend Greatorex preached from the country pulpit on the 14th Sunday after Trinity, and the Duke sat in the Carteret family pew at the south side of the chancel arch, and Charity sat in the parish clerk's pew beside the south porch in plain dark serge, with the clean white collar of the parish clerk's daughter's dress. At the end of the service at 11:30, the Duke waited at the south porch and walked Charity back along the country lane to the clerk's cottage gate, with Mrs. Fothergill 3 paces behind. They walked the half-mile in the composed Derbyshire summer noon without speaking past the standing country civilities. At the cottage gate he inclined. "Miss Burbage, Your Grace." He went on up the lane to the south gate of the park. By the Friday evening of the 23rd of July, 1819, the Hartington country house had gone down to its composed Carteret night by 10 o'clock. Mrs. Fothergill had locked the south door at 9:30. Mrs. Menwaring had banked the kitchen fire. Mr. Bromhall had brought up the writing tray to the south library at 9:45, with the small decanter of Madeira and the single trimmed lamp and the writing paper of the Hartington Park private allowance, and had set them down at the writing table without speaking, and had inclined, and had gone out by the south library door. The Duke sat down at the south library writing table at midnight. The clock at the south library mantel had struck the 12 at the steady Hartington Park midnight pace. The fire had been built up at 11:30 by Mr. Bromhall's kitchen boy, and stood now at the steady glow of a low Derbyshire summer fire. The single trimmed lamp stood at the south side of the writing table at its own steady yellow circle. The south library window opened the standing 6 inches at the Hartington Park summer night custom, let in the steady Derbyshire summer night silence of the south lawn and the south gate beyond. He drew from the writing table drawer the green calf commonplace book of the late second Duke his father, who had died at Hartington Park at the age of 63 of a quiet apoplexy at 6:30 on the Monday morning of the 12th of March, 1810. The book had stood in the drawer the 9 years and 4 months since. The third Duke had not, in those 9 years and 4 months, written in it. It stood at the last entry of his late father's steady country hand, dated the Sunday evening of the 4th of March, 1810, 8 days before his death, in the matter of the standing parish coal allowance of Hartington-on-the-Wye. He opened the book at the first clean page after that last entry. He set the steel pen at the small brass standish. He drew the writing paper close. He dipped the pen at the brass inkpot. He set the pen at the head of the page in the careful copper plate hand of the Carteret schoolroom of the 1790s, and he wrote, at the head of the page, the composed date of Friday evening, the 23rd of July, 1819, and he sat the composed half-minute in the steady Carteret resolution of the Hartington Park midnight, and he set down the pen at the standish, and sat at the writing table over the green calf commonplace book of the late second Duke his father, and he began to draft, in his own careful copper-plate hand, the composed proposal he should make to Miss Charity Burbage, parish clerk of Hartington-on-the-Wye, at 3 o'clock at the clerk's cottage in the lane behind St. Giles's on the Saturday afternoon of the 24th of July, 1819. Saturday morning, the 24th of July, 1819, came in over the high peak with a small, clear country light upon the lane behind St. Giles's, and a small, steady warmth in the hedges of the south paddock, and the small thrush, calling from the elder by the parish well. At 2:45, the Duke of Hartington's plain, dark travelling chaise drew up at the small green gate of the clerk's cottage, and Mr. Bromhall, the white-haired butler, who had ridden down with his master from the park on the box, opened the small green gate, and stood 3 paces back at the lane. The Duke walked up the small flagged path in plain dark superfine and a plain white cravat, and went in at the small cottage door, which Mrs. Fothergill, the housekeeper, had opened to him a half-minute earlier. He did not speak in the small passage. Mrs. Fothergill, in plain bombazine and the linen cap she always wore in town errand, inclined her iron-grey head and led him through to the small south parlour, where Charity stood at the small parlour table in plain dark serge and the clean white collar of her parish office, the clear pale green eyes very steady upon him. He bowed. She inclined. "Miss Burbage, I am much obliged to you and to Mrs. Fothergill for the granting of this hour. Will you be seated?" She sat at the small parlour table. Mrs. Fothergill took the small upright chair by the south window, set her sewing upon her knee, and did not raise her eyes. The Duke laid upon the table between them the small green calf commonplace book that had been the late second Duke's, opened the small brass clasp, turned to the page he had set going at midnight on the Friday last, and read steadily from the page in the small, upright country hand he had been at since his return from town in March. "Miss Charity Burbage, parish clerk of the parish of Hartington-on-the-Wye, in the High Peak of the county of Derbyshire, daughter of the late Mr. Silas Burbage, parish clerk of this parish from the year 1798 to October 1815, and of the late Mrs. Ottoline Burbage of the Vine family of Bakewell. I am Bertram Edward Carteret, 3rd Duke of Hartington Park, in the High Peak of the county of Derbyshire, of the parish in which you hold your office. I am at this hour of 3 o'clock of the Saturday morning, the 24th of July, 1819, in the small south parlour of the small clerk's cottage in the lane behind St. Giles's, in the proper presence of Mrs. Phoebe Fothergill, the housekeeper of Hartington Park, come to ask you plainly whether you will do me the honour of becoming my wife. I have caused the parish account book to be settled upon a proper standing footing, that your office of parish clerk shall continue under the Reverend Greatorex at the standing salary of £15 the year, the small parish desk at the south study of the rectory to remain at your direction, and the quarterly account book to remain in your keeping by your own wish. I have caused the marriage settlements to be drawn in plain country fashion at Mr. Travers's office in Lincoln's Inn, the jointure set at £1,000 the year upon the Hartington Park rent roll, the pin money at £300 the year upon my own private allowance, the small clerk's cottage in the lane behind St. Giles's to be purchased outright from the parish at the standing village rate, and to remain at your direction in remembrance of your late father, and the small parish bench rate of the 4 widows of the parish to be raised by my private gift to the standing sum of £25 the year in perpetuity. I have spoken of this matter to my sister Lady Drusilla Markham, and to my brother-in-law Sir Hubert Markham, who are come down from Markham Hall in Cheshire, and lie this morning at the park, and who are warmly of one mind with me. I ask you, in plain country fashion, with no other claim upon you than my honour and my plain affection, whether you will become Charity Carteret, Duchess of Hartington, and the wife of a countryman who at this hour is more steady in his attachment to you than to any matter standing upon his own estate. He closed the small green calf book. He did not look away. The grey-blue eyes rested upon her without claim and without pressure. The small, steady country morning light came in at the south window and lay across the small parlour table between them. Charity laid her own steady hand upon the small parlour table, set the clear, pale green eyes upon his without a tremor, and answered him in the small, composed country voice that had carried the parish accounts at Lady Day. "Your Grace, I shall." He inclined deeply. Mrs. Fothergill set her sewing aside, rose 3 paces from the window, dropped a small, steady country curtsy, and went out at the small parlour door to send Mr. Bromhall to the kitchen for the small kettle. The Duke took her hand across the small parlour table and held it without speech for the length of a country minute, then said only, "I am much obliged to you, Charity," and set the small green calf book to the side, and they sat in plain country composure at the small parlour table, while Mrs. Fothergill brought in the small kitchen tea-tray at 3:15. That evening at 7:30, at Hartington Park, Lady Drusilla Markham came down to the small east parlour in plain country dress, the dark hair plain at her temples, the kind hazel eyes already steady upon her brother at the south door. Sir Hubert Markham stood at the small east hearth in the plain dark green coat. The Duke had sent up word at 6. "Drusilla, Sir Hubert, Miss Burbage has answered me this afternoon at the small clerk's cottage. She shall be Carteret." Lady Drusilla crossed the small east parlour in 3 steady country steps, took her brother's hand in both of hers, and said only, "Bertram, I had hoped you should ask her at 3 this morning, and I had hoped she should say so. I shall write to her this evening at the cottage." Sir Hubert inclined and said in the plain country bass, "Carteret, I am much obliged to you for the news." They sat the half-hour at the small east tea-tray, Mrs. Menwaring's plain country seed-cake at the small east table, Mr. Bromhall at the small east door. Lady Drusilla set the wedding date at the small east table at 8:20, the Saturday morning of the 14th of August, at 10 of the clock, at St. Giles's, in plain country fashion. The Duke agreed steadily. Sir Hubert agreed steadily. Lady Drusilla went up to the small east writing desk in the small east parlour at 8:45 and set going at the small steady country pen a small note to Charity at the small clerk's cottage in the lane, sealing it at the small east candle with the small Markham country seal of plain silver. And the note was carried down to the small clerk's cottage by the under-footman at 9:45 of the same evening. The Duke sent down at the small east desk a second small composed note to the Reverend Greatorex at the rectory, asking that the standing parish banns be set going at the small reading desk of St. Giles's at the morning service of the morrow at 11 of the clock, and that the parish marriage register be made ready for the standing entry of the 14th of August. The Reverend Greatorex sent up word at the small rectory at 10:15 that he would set the banns going at the morrow in plain country fashion. On the Sunday morning of the 25th of July, 1819, at the small 11 o'clock parish service at St. Giles's, the Reverend Greatorex, in the plain black cassock and the gold-rimmed spectacles, stood at the small reading desk under the south window, and read the first of the 3 banns in the plain country voice the parish had heard at every wedding in the parish for 30 years. I publish the banns of marriage between Bertram Edward Carteret, 3rd Duke of Hartington, bachelor of this parish, and Charity Burbage, spinster of this parish. If any of you know cause or just impediment why these 2 persons should not be joined together in holy matrimony, ye are to declare it. This is the first time of asking. He paused, in the plain country pause of the standing custom of the parish since 1731, and the small steady country congregation held its breath at the parish bench, and no voice came. He inclined and went on to the small parish prayer for the day. Charity sat in the parish clerk's pew beside the south porch in plain dark serge and the clean white collar. The Duke sat in the family pew on the south side, in plain dark superfine. Lady Drusilla and Sir Hubert sat at his side. Mrs. Fothergill stood at the small south aisle. The second banns were read on the Sunday morning of the 1st of August. The third banns were read on the Sunday morning of the 8th of August. No voice came at the second asking, and no voice came at the third. On the Saturday morning of the 14th of August, 1819, at 9:45 of the clock, the small parish bell of St. Giles's was set going by old John Moseley the sexton in the small bell tower at the south porch, and the plain country congregation of the village of Hartington on the Wye came in at the small south door in plain country dress and took the parish bench in the standing order of the parish since 1731. The morning was clear, with a small steady country light upon the small south porch and the small box hedge and the small lane behind the bell tower. At 10 of the clock, the small chaise drew up at the small lych gate, and Mr. Travers, the thin grey-haired family solicitor in the plain black superfine and the gold-rimmed spectacles, handed Charity down at the lych gate in plain country fashion. She wore plain cream muslin in the simple country cut, a small white rose pinned at the bodice in the standing custom of a country bride of the parish, and a plain white cottage bonnet tied at the chin with a plain white ribbon. She carried no flowers. The clear, pale green eyes were very steady upon the small south porch. Mr. Travers gave her his arm and walked her up the small flagged path through the small box hedge to the south porch. And at the south porch, the Reverend Greatorex stood in plain white surplice and the gold-rimmed spectacles, the small parish prayer book set going at the marriage office. At the chancel step, the Duke of Hartington stood in plain dark, superfine and a plain white cravat, the firm Carteret jaw composed, the grey-blue eyes resting upon her without claim. Sir Hubert Markham stood 3 paces behind his shoulder. Lady Drusilla Markham, in plain country dress of pale grey silk and a small white cap, stood at the bride's side as matron of honour. Mrs. Fothergill stood at the small south aisle. Mr. Bromhall stood at the small south door. Mrs. Mainwaring stood at the small north aisle in plain blue print cotton beneath the cook's clean Sunday apron. The Reverend Greatorex read the marriage office from the small parish prayer book in the plain country voice of the standing custom of the parish since 1731. The Duke answered, "I will," in the plain country bass. Charity answered, "I will," in the small composed country voice. Mr. Travers gave her hand into the Duke's at the proper word. The plain country ring, gold and unadorned, was set upon her hand at the chancel step. The Reverend Greatorex pronounced them man and wife at 10:15 of the clock, and signed the parish marriage register at the small parish desk in the south chancel 3 minutes later, with Mr. Travers and Lady Drusilla as the standing witnesses of the marriage of the parish. They came out at the small south porch at 10:30, the small parish bell set going by old John Moseley a second time at the south bell tower, and the small country congregation set in the plain country shower of small white rose petals along the small flagged path through the box hedge to the lych gate, in the plain country custom of the parish for 30 years. At Hartington Park, at 11:15, Mrs. Mainwaring set the wedding breakfast at the long oak table in the south dining parlour. A plain country boiled ham, a plain country cold round of beef, a plain country game pie, a plain country dish of green peas from the south kitchen garden, a plain country apricot tart from the south wall, a plain country seed cake of the cook's standing receipt, and a small plain country bride cake of 3 tiers in plain white icing set at the head of the table. Mr. Bromhall stood at the south door in the plain black butler's coat of 30 years' service. Mrs. Fothergill stood at the side of the long oak table, the small steady country eye upon the small flute glasses and the small country claret. The Reverend Greatorex sat at the small east end. Mr. Travers sat at the small west end. Lady Drusilla sat at the bride's right. Sir Hubert sat at the Duke's left. The Duke rose at the head of the table at noon, lifted the small flute glass of country claret in the steady country hand, and said only, "I give you the Duchess of Hartington, Charity Carteret, of this parish and of Hartington Park." The small country company stood at the long oak table and drank the standing country toast in steady country composure. Charity inclined to the company in plain country fashion and did not rise. They sat the small, steady country wedding breakfast, the full hour and 3/4, and at 2 of the clock, Mr. Travers handed the bride and groom into the plain dark Carteret travelling chaise at the South Carriage Sweep for the small country wedding tour of 3 weeks in the Lakes, to the small inn at Grasmere and the small cottage at Ambleside that the late dowager had been used to take in the 1790s. Lady Drusilla stood at the South Carriage Sweep at 2 of the clock and said only, "Charity, I shall come over to the park at the small last week of August, and we shall sit at the South Library at the tea-tray, and you shall tell me of the inn at Grasmere." Charity inclined and answered in plain country fashion, "Drusilla, I shall be much obliged." Mr. Bromhall closed the chaise door. Mrs. Fothergill inclined. The chaise drew out at the lodge gate at 2:05. 7 months and 18 days after the wedding, on the cold, pale blue Saturday morning of the 1st of April, 1820, their first child, a daughter, christened Pauline Charity Carteret, after the late Dowager Lady Pauline Carteret, and the mother, was baptized at St. Giles's Parish Church, Hartington-on-the-Wye, by the Reverend Greatorex, with Lady Drusilla Markham standing as godmother and Sir Hubert Markham as godfather. The Carteret family Bible entry was written in the third Duke's own hand at the South Library writing table that evening, beside the entry for his late mother Lady Pauline of March 1817, and the entry for the late Mr. Silas Burbage parish clerk of October 1815, which his wife had asked be set there in plain country fashion. Tuesday evening, the 27th of October 1820, came in at Hartington Park, with a small clear country chill upon the south terrace and a small steady country fire upon the South Library hearth. At 8:30 of the clock, in the small South Library, a single trimmed reading lamp burned on the small low table between 2 wing chairs drawn close to the small steady country fire. The small parish account book lay open at the small parish desk by the south window, set there for the morrow's Lady Day quarterly entry. Still in the new Duchess's keeping by her own standing wish, the £15 quarterly stipend of the parish clerk's office transferred to the parish poor at the Duchess's standing direction since the wedding. The infant Pauline Charity Carteret slept upstairs in the small north nursery in the plain country cradle of plain oak that had been the late dowager's at her own christening in 1763. Mrs. Fothergill sat at the small north chair beside the cradle in plain bombazine. The small country house lay in steady country composure. In the South Library, in the wing chair on the small east side of the small steady country fire, Charity sat in plain dark silk of evening with the clean white collar, the soft chestnut-brown hair pinned plain, the clear pale green eyes very steady upon the small octavo volume in her hand. The volume was the plain country copy of the new novel from the small London printer that Mr. Travers had sent down to her at the South Library in the post of the Tuesday morning last, the small octavo of Miss Austen's Persuasion, with the small printed dedication of the author's brother on the small first page. In the wing chair on the small west side, the third Duke of Hartington sat in plain dark, superfine and a plain white cravat, the firm Carteret jaw composed, the grey-blue eyes resting upon her without claim, the streak of silver above the left temple catching the small, steady country lamplight at the small, low table. She read aloud to him in the small, composed country voice that had read at the South Library at 3 the year before. She read of the small, steady country heroine, the young woman of the South Country, the second daughter, who had been thought past her bloom at 27, who had set going the small, steady country letter at the small parlour table of the small inn at the Western Port. The Duke listened in plain country composure, the long country hand at rest upon the small wing-chair arm, the small steady country lamp upon the small low table between them. At 9 of the clock, she closed the small octavo at the small ribbon she had set in at the foot of the small printed page, laid it upon the small low table, and inclined to him in plain country fashion. He inclined in plain country fashion. Mr. Bromhall came in at the small south door at 9:15, with the small night candle for the south staircase, and the small, steady country house went up to the small north bedroom in plain country fashion. So it had come about, in plain country fashion, that the small, steady country ledger entry drawn up at the small parish desk in the south study of the rectory at Hartington-on-the-Wye, on the small composed Saturday morning of the 27th of March, in the year of our Lord 1819, the small careful country bookkeeping of the parish receipts and the parish disbursements for the quarter ending Lady Day 1819, with the standing Hartington Park parish coal allowance of £4 the year and the parish clerk's salary of £3 the quarter, set out at the small steady country columns, and the totals struck at the foot in the small steady country hand of Miss Charity Burbage, parish clerk, in the office of her late father, the late Mr. Silas Burbage, parish clerk of this parish, had brought down to the rectory at noon of that small composed Saturday morning the 3rd Duke of Hartington upon a small standing parish coal matter, and had then carried him by the small Monday calls, and the small Wednesday calls, and the small Friday calls, and the small Sunday afternoons at the small clerk's cottage, through the small country spring of the parish, to the small Tuesday readings of the South Library at 1 of the clock, and had carried him through the small slander of Sir Eustace Quibell of London at the small 1st of June, and through the small collapse of Sir Eustace at the small middle of July, at the small drawing-rooms of town that Lady Drusilla had set straight, to the small proposal of the small south parlour of the small clerk's cottage, at 3 of the Saturday morning of the 24th of July, 1819, and through the 3 small bands at the small reading desk of St. Giles's on the small Sundays of the 25th of July, and the 1st of August and the 8th of August, to the small country wedding of the Saturday morning of the 14th of August, 1819, at 10 of the clock, at St. Giles's, and through the small christening of Pauline Charity Carteret, at St. Giles's, on the small Saturday morning of the 1st of April, 1820, to the small steady country lamp of the small South Library at 8:30, of the small Tuesday evening of the 27th of October, 1820, and at the small low table between the 2 wing chairs of the small South Library, at 8:30 of that small Tuesday evening, the small trimmed country lamp burned steady upon the small page of persuasion that the parish clerk's daughter, now Duchess of Hartington, had laid open at the small ribbon for the morrow.